we're delighted to welcome you all to this conversation on Life Beyond Waste, Work and Infrastructure in Urban Pakistan by Vikas Bhatt. We greet you today from occupied and settled territories of indigenous people who have stewarded this land for generations. Lenila Napi, Shwani, Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, and others. Thefts of indigenous land, dispossession, and destruction of lives, livelihoods, and ecological relations are violently ongoing in our contemporary moment. As indigenous people and allies resist these processes, here in Turtle Island, in Palestine and Gaza, in Sudan, Congo, Kashmir, and elsewhere, we stand in solidarity with their calls and struggles for ceasefire, land back, environmental justice, and abolition. We started the South Asian Urban Climates Collective in 2019 as a series of dialogues about the place of South Asian cities as crucial sites of climate change, but taking the changing of climates to be inextricable from ongoing logics of colonization and erasure, and to think with the terms that Vikas has offered us in his book about the constant making and remaking of urban lives in these cities in ways that are historically and socially situated. And then to be attentive to local histories, to caste, class, and gendered politics of the urban, and to the differentiated place-based experiences of urban climates and the forms and ways that people make their worlds within them. The project also seeks to foster, and hence we're all here, a transnational and interdisciplinary community of scholars, educators, artists, students, practitioners, and others who work closely and critically at the intersections of climate, politics, and urbanism in South Asia. Last year, together with some of the members of the collective, including Vikas, we published an article in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Studies, which explored some of these themes. And we're very proud to have launched our online platform, which we hope can offer opportunities for further comparative insights across ongoing issues in South Asian cities, and to bring emerging scholarship into a publicly accessible format, and to build more opportunities for networking and building relationships within this growing community. And then really quickly, before we introduce our guests, I want to share that we're going to share a call for submissions that we are opening for the website. And we'd love to invite scholars, writers, artists, activists, designers, planners, and others who are working on the contemporary politics and cultures of urban environments in South Asia to submit case studies of their ongoing work for publication on the website. We will put up the link for the submission form in the chat, and we'll do that again at the end of our panel today. And also, if you're on our listserv, please look out for an email from us in the next day or two about the full call, which will keep open until, I think, the end of May. And if you're not on our listserv, of course, and if you want to be, just reach out to us and we'll be very happy to add you in.
Thanks, Nida, for doing this part of the introduction. So my name is Aparna Parekh, and I'm the co-organizer of today's event and of South Asian Urban Climates. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome our panelists in conversation about Vikas Bhatt's new book titled Life Beyond Waste, which was published by Stanford University Press. Building upon conversations about changing configurations of work and labor under capitalism, and utilizing a theoretical framework of reproduction, Vikas Bhatt traces how forms of life in Punjab, organized around caste-based relations, have become embedded in infrastructures across Pakistan, making them crucial to numerous processes which are unfolding at distinct scales. Life Beyond Waste maintains that processes reproducing life in a city like Lahore must be critically assessed along the lines of caste, class, and religion, which have been constitutive features of urbanism across South Asia. Vikas Bhatt is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. His research, more broadly, takes a stigmatized form of labor, waste work, as a point of entry to explore two interrelated questions. First, how have historical events, both past and ongoing, how do these continually reshape Pakistan's fraught urban landscapes? And second, in what ways have the connections among caste, waste, labor, and infrastructures both endured and transformed across South Asia? And of course, we see how these questions animate the book itself. And to respond to this book, we're excited to welcome our panelists, Yafa Trula and Dean Chahim, who have very generously agreed to engage Vikas and all of us in discussion about the book. So Yafa Trula works at the intersection of urban geography and human environment relations, examining connections between urban waterscapes and socio-political processes in cities of the global south, deploying water and its infrastructures as a lens for analyzing social and material relations in cities, as well as differing regimes and institutions of everyday urban governance. Her work is predominantly focused on Indian cities, contributing to theorizations of urban and feminist political ecologies, southern and comparative urbanism, and actually existing modalities of urban water governance in post-colonial cities. Her more recent work includes a collaborative intra-urban comparison of precarious infrastructures in the cities of Mumbai, Delhi, and Cape Town. She's an assistant professor of geography at the University of Colorado. Our other panelist, Dean Chahim, is assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at NYU. Trained as both an anthropologist and environmental engineer, his work broadly traces the entanglements of political power, engineering, and the urban environment, and how unjust environmental conditions are produced and sustained through engineering practices, and how those might be made otherwise. His book project, Governing Disaster, Engineering and the Growth of Mexico City, is an ethnography and history of flood control engineering in modern Mexico City. It reveals how engineering has become a crucial mode of governing disaster and enabling the imaginary of endless growth that is so central to the Anthropocene. He's also working on a new project focused on climate change, speed, and the politics of transportation engineering in Mexico City. We now invite our panelists to each provide comments for about 15 minutes, followed by a response by Vikas. We'll indicate to you when you're at about 12 minutes or so, just so you have a sense of things. And after Vikas has had a chance to respond, we will open up to the audience for questions and further dialogue. And please feel free to use to kind of put questions in the chat as we go along, and Neeta and I will try to monitor the chat as much as we can. We will mute everyone, so when you do have to speak, please remember to unmute yourself. So yeah, Yafa, if you want to take it away.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Let me start off by saying thank you so much to Aparna and Nida for inviting me to do this and for gathering us all together in this forum through so many different modalities. It's been amazing since sort of the first time I was ever invited to be part of this. So thank you so much for that. And I'm really just looking forward to engaging more with this book. I wanted to also preface this by saying, as you sort of, you can imagine from the introduction, that my work is a little bit transversely engaging with waste. So I'm not immersed in the waste literature, but focusing more on water and everyday infrastructures. But I hope that this, my own sort of theoretical orientation, can lead to some entry points that are productive, even if it's a bit transversal. So I want to also begin by saying that Vikas Bhatt has produced a beautifully written book in Life Beyond Waste that chronicles how lives and life worlds in urban Pakistan have been reworked and transformed in relation to waste, labor, and infrastructure. And there are numerous literatures that he's building on in this work, including literature on waste, discard, infrastructures, caste, intersectionality, Southern urbanism, and feminist work on reproduction. And because he's bringing so much together, he really makes a number of novel contributions and provocations. For me, at the core of this book is urging the audience to continually unpack the complexities of how everyday infrastructures that make cities and make urban life operate through and emerge from historical inequities and interdependencies, with the potential to transcend some aspects of these structures and processes. In the book, we hear stories of waste laborers, kabarayans, or junkyard owners who act as in intermediary roles, government officials, and other public authorities kind of at the seam of the state, and we're simultaneously taken into the multiple worlds and spaces of waste encounters, be it when waste laborers interact with middle or upper class and caste residents in their homes, removing waste, to waste workers who sort and store waste in their own homes or jugyeon as they attempt to slowly build up their housing, often using some materials procured from their own waste work while navigating tenure insecurity and often multiple rounds of demolition in Lahore's peripheries. And critically, the book carefully navigates the reader through the ways that historical inequalities of caste, class, religion, and at times gender emerge, are reproduced, and contested in contemporary waste worlds. So I want to start, I have 3 themes. I'm a little nervous that I may have to just leave it at 2 because I don't want to go over time. So we'll see how far we get. But as I kind of go through these themes that really struck me in the book, I wanted to just preface this by saying 2 things. Is one, this book is so rich. It was extremely hard to choose a few themes. So I'm not getting to a lot of points I would have loved to get to. The other thing is that within each theme, I will ask a few questions to Waqas, but Waqas, don't feel pressure to answer all of these because I probably have too many. I might have about 6 questions embedded in this, and you don't need to address all of those for the sake of time as well. Okay, so let me start with this theme 1, which you know, to go deeper into this commentary, I want to actually start with the book's ending. As outlined in the coda that concludes the book, Waqas discusses his choice to focus not simply on what he calls extractive and damage-based narratives of waste, but rather to prioritize how waste is tied to the reproduction of urban life, as waste labor is literally an infrastructure that enables urban life, in an effort to, in his words, quote, shift the stories we tell about places like Pakistan in the contemporary moment. There is a tension in holding processes of extraction and the embodied and structural violences that accompany waste work with what emerges through a wider analytical focus on how lives and life worlds are produced in relation to waste work. I find this tension to be really productive. While Waqas orients the concept of reproduction as a way to center and excavate his analysis of the complex ways waste infrastructures and labor are central to urban life infrastructures in myriad ways, he does not ignore the embodied and structural forms of violence that undergird and often become reproduced in the daily labor to sort, circulate, and process waste in this contemporary moment of capitalism in which consumption-producing waste is at an all-time high. For example, in chapter 5, we hear about the exhaustion and, quote, slow death that occurs through the quotidian, everyday requirements of waste labor, noting the damage done to workers' bodies who consistently require antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, injections, and salves, amidst being exposed to harmful materials that perpetuate illness, exhaustion, and adverse health outcomes. Slow death here, which emerges from residents' own narratives, evokes parallels with Nixon's concept of slow violence, as well as other scholars who bring Nixon's slow violence concept to infrastructures through the idea of slow infrastructural violence. This is something my own work has examined. In Life Beyond Waste, we see how the structural and historical violences of caste, class, and religious inequities become reproduced in contemporary times precisely in relation to infrastructures that surround the disposal and recycling of waste, as well as the ways that such violences are contested or exceeded in the reproduction of life in Pakistan. So I find, again, this tension between these structures and between thinking of reproduction as ways that exceed and expand on possibilities really productive. As the book states, quote, indeed, the lives of waste workers and their kin have been actualized in ways that always are in potential excess of these entanglements. As such, the book compellingly argues that an orientation towards reproduction gives us insights not only into configurations of waste and labor under contemporary capitalism, but also, quote, what forms of living and working are actually possible for those waste workers who inhabit urbanizing landscapes like Lahore. These forms of living Both indicate waste workers experience some substantial inroads into the city through things like leveraging loans and credit to launch businesses that enable them to potentially transcend some of their waste work or move up the ladder within it, or using relations with the middle class to gain more materials to build up their own homes and houses, while others may be more constrained through indebtedness and the difficulty in making ends meet on a daily basis. Thus, the book's orientation toward the linkages between social reproduction, or the ways that care and unremunerated forms of living support urban life, and the reproductive nature of waste labor in enabling the city and its inhabitants to function through the disposing of, circulating, and processing of waste materials, forms the central thread that connects many differing foci of the book and effectively demonstrates how the reproduction of life is tied to waste in ways that present possibilities to waste workers and exceed its violences. So a couple of questions here. One question in my mind in relation to these tensions is whether there still remains a containment or sort of a ceiling of the possibilities that you write so eloquently about. I'd love to hear more about that and thinking about waste futures and the lives of those who do waste work. Another question I have regarding this theme is whether there are broader implications in your findings regarding waste work for how we understand infrastructural labor more generally, beyond simply waste infrastructures, not that they're simple, or your case study here in Pakistan. Given that there's been a recent surge in literature that looks at the everyday gendered, racialized, and unequal practices and social material relations that shape the ways particular bodies and urban residents maintain, prop up, extend, repair, or even substitute for absent infrastructures, do you see your research on waste work having broader applicability to these other infrastructures and these other forms of labor beyond waste? Okay, so I will go on to theme 2, and then we'll see if we even have time for theme 3. Okay, theme 2 is broadly, I've titled Caste Intersectionality and Waste Infrastructures. So what I want to turn to is the book's important and novel focus here on caste and its intersectionality with class, religion, and sometimes gender in shaping infrastructures of labor, waste, and life in Lahore and urban Pakistan more broadly, and also Pakistan more broadly, even outside of the urban dimension, in demonstrating how individual and collective life is stitched together through the ways waste work upholds what Wakas calls, quote, lives and worlds across Lahore's unevenly urbanizing landscape. The book critically analyzes the ways that historically produced constructions of caste inequalities significantly shape waste infrastructure and labor in ways that have previously been almost exclusively read as class-based, not caste-based. This is a critical move in illuminating the centrality of historical caste inequities in shaping contemporary urban life and infrastructure, something that is sorely needed in the literature and in our analytic understanding of urbanization, infrastructure, and everyday life in cities of Pakistan, as well as the rest of South Asia and beyond. As the book states, quote, caste-based relations are not simply part of some past form to be considered. Rather, this book argues that those forms and the identities and relations upon which they were built have organized and canalized many of the distributive processes through which capitalism, urbanization, ecologies, and the worlds of waste materialize themselves in Pakistan today. In particular, the book reveals, through both historical study and contemporary fieldwork, the ways that low and non-caste bodies have been historically excluded from land owning and agricultural work in Pakistan, limiting opportunities for class ascension, and relegating the growing imperative for waste work in colonial and post-colonial times to low and non-caste bodies, the latter also including Christians. Thus, the book's analysis of caste works within what can be seen, broadly speaking, as an intersectionality framework that considers points of convergence between caste, class, religion, and in some points, gender as well. Chapter 1 of the book, for example, maps out how the accumulation of power, wealth, and status, including differing caste and class groups' relationships with state institutions, ownership and control over land, and the kinds of work and labor these relationships entailed, have shaped Pakistan's history and continue to shape infrastructures of urban life around caste-based relations and reproduce those. These historical caste inequities and interdependencies play a substantial role, thus, in contemporary waste labor, the symbolism and embodied experiences of waste work, and the intimacies and distances that constitute reproduction of life through waste infrastructure in the city. Again, to phrase it in the book's own words, quote, approaching waste work as an infrastructure enables us to see how this particular form of work allows collective life in a city like Lahore to go on, while at the same time reproducing systems of graded inequality, i.e. caste-based relations, upon which waste work is premised. The book enmeshes us in life stories and circumstances that show the complex caste dimensions of waste work and its rippling consequences for life in the city. For example, we hear of how particular understandings of waste labor, even amongst laborers themselves, rest on distinguishing whether one was, quote, born into this labor, in other words, through caste, or whether it was, quote, chosen due to life circumstances. In other moments of ethnographic description, we read how the congruent intimacies and distances of lower non-caste workers entering middle-class homes to collect waste are both based on and perform caste inequalities. For example, when one waste worker who was well known to this middle-class family and was allowed regular free access to their home, even with doors being open and without really a supervisory eye to collect and manage their waste, this intimacy was congruently met with distancing and hierarchical practices that accompany the relationship between waste worker and middle-class or upper caste groups, including those with long-standing and purportedly friendly relationships. While middle and upper classes and castes depend on waste workers to rid their homes of dirt, rubbish, all kinds of substances and waste material resulting from their consumption and their higher consumption levels, this cleansing of their homes gets attached to those middle class identities in a way that contrasts that of the waste worker. Further, Waqas recounts how one waste broker describes waste workers as not only removing germs, but becoming germs themselves, showing the ways that caste hierarchies are activated in everyday practices like removing waste from middle-class homes that continually transform and shape not only their bodies, but their statuses in society. Other practices between waste workers and middle-class residents also demonstrate simultaneous forms of intimacy and distance, including this unidirectional gifts of care that come from middle-class homeowners to waste workers that actually enact the inequality further of the relationship. Instead of being reciprocal, which would be more on even grounds, as Waqas shows us, more of an even playing field, the book shows how gifts of care from homeowners to waste workers are framed as benevolent care. These could be gifts like giving some materials, giving some food. Such gifts do little to shift the undervaluation of waste workers' labor and status, even as they may assist a worker with extra materials or supplies. While Waqas states early in the book that he was not able to conduct interviews with women in private and home spaces, thus limiting some aspects of his research and focus on gender, I wondered if you, Waqas, had preliminary observations or data that speak to the gendered bodies involved in waste work that may have similar or differing experiences intersecting with these caste hierarchies, particularly in intimate spaces, which I know you didn't have, amazing access to, but whether those were the spaces of, a homeowner or one's own home. So I'd be curious if you have some more that you could speak to there. And I do have a last thing, but I'm willing to suspend that if I'm sorry, I haven't been able to monitor the chat because I'm sort of looking at my notes here. So I'll leave it to the moderators if we need to cut it, which is absolutely fine.
Thanks, Rafa. Yafa, we're right on time, but you can mention it and then we can come back to it maybe later if you have
Sure, yeah. And luckily, I think this one is slightly a little bit shorter. So I'll mention it. My third theme is disposability, circulation, and value. Maybe I can just say 4 or 5 sentences on that. Okay. A final theme that I want to touch on is this, disposability, circulation, and value. The book states that, quote, combining disposability and circulation, waste infrastructures are composed of and enact a series of ordered and transformative relations among materials, things, bodies, persons, spaces, and forms of work. So infrastructures of disposability bring together municipal and informal workers, supervisors, containers, and other objects. And such materials are taken away to other locations, often the urban periphery, where workers live themselves, to be sold, sorted, utilized, or processed in junkyards, warehouses, foundries, mills, and wholesale markets, and in workers' homes themselves. Okay, so I'm interested in sort of what costs. According to the book, the work of waste workers and Kabarian actually contributes to meeting needs, but not always accumulation through circulation. So there's different kind of values associated with disposability and circulation. And what Koss states in his book, different forms of value become materialized from waste, depending on, quote, highly interpersonal and localized interactions among households, waste workers, junkyard owners, intermediaries, and many others. So basically, I've shortened this, but I'd love to hear more if there's ever time, and I know I've asked several questions already, from Waqas on the complex ways waste work and labor sits with the logics of capitalist urbanization in Pakistan. I know the book is discussing this, but I'd like to hear more about those complex logics, as well as how we understand differing constructions of value and disposability. And here I'm thinking about Rosalind Frederick's work on waste infrastructure and what she terms garbage citizenship, which is also the title of her book, in Dakar, Senegal. So in this book, she shows how waste infrastructures become devolved onto gendered bodies, and the ways particular gender, class, and ethno-religious groups not only work with disposable materials, but become further disposable themselves in the process. And I was just curious, Waqas, if you see any particular parallels or contrasts in your findings regarding waste and the construction of value and disposability. All right, well, I'll end with that. Thanks so much. And looking forward to Dean's comments as well and the discussion that ensues.
Thanks, Yafa. Dean, if you want to get us started, I'll kind of give you a warning at 12 minutes and then give you another reminder.
I'll also just put this so that I can see. Okay, great. Well, and I think I had some of my introductory comments have been said a little bit already, and I think by the really excellent interventions already. So I'll try to just highlight a few things that are for background for those of you who haven't read the book yet. And I think the most actually, but backing up for a second, I should say that I was surprised by this invitation to come because I don't know almost nothing about South Asia or caste. I mean, my family might have certain origins there, but it's not really something I know much about. So when I was reading this, I was really reading this from the perspective of somebody who studies Mexico City, and I was actually, and I worked a lot with engineers, but I also spent a lot of time with these workers who were actually involved in cleaning the drains and making this sewage system, which is also their flood control system, flow. And so there's a lot of the ethnographic, I mean, this is a really rich ethnography. I mean, there are moments where I could see myself in Waqas's discussions. There's a very memorable scene where Waqas describes because he really gets into it. And I think that's something that maybe we haven't mentioned. I mean, he really is going along with these waste workers, doing exactly the same things they're doing, and experiencing the kinds of discomfort that comes with initially getting so close to waste. And so there's this really remarkable scene in which he is asked to help pick up this sack of this dirty, it's like multiple times reused old sheet to pick up and lift it onto somebody's head. And in the process, he gets covered by this waste and is scrubbing his hands 20,000 times before he eats. I mean, that visceral experience, I think, is just what makes the ethnography so important. And I think, and something that really does not treat waste, does not treat the people involved in waste as sort of abjected out there. I mean, it's very much, he's trying to participate in the process. And I think that just, in terms of the writing, the way he did this, I think it's really remarkable. And it reminded me of many of my own experiences, which I'm happy to talk about later, but I want to get into the book. So I think that, this core argument that capitalism and urbanization depend on these historical identities and categories of and inequalities, primarily of caste. I think that's really the central concept. Although he definitely talks about religion and gender and class as well, but I'm going to focus on caste. And I think that what it was really important that he describes is that these caste-based inequalities predate capitalism and are therefore not explainable by these sort of presentist accounts that I think he's suggesting, if I understand correctly, permeate discard studies more broadly, which is this new kind of burgeoning field now, which looks at how the understanding of waste and processes of making things wastable, wastelands, making things disposable, actually helps us understand the world anew in a very different, way. But unfortunately, a lot of those accounts do take this kind of more global, everything can be explained by the move to globalization, to capitalism, and disposability. But if we stay with the actual ways in which people work with waste, he's suggesting that we might actually understand something different about how these systems are reproduced and how forms of life are nevertheless made amid these ostensibly abjected conditions. So, and the other thing that I think is really crucial that he's showing is how this expansive, explosive urbanization of Lahore, with all of its, with the ascendancy of so many people into the sense of the middle class and high consumption lifestyles, is reproduced by this everyday work of waste workers to cart away people's waste, to sort it, to collect it, to find ways to commodify what's left of it. I mean, he has these amazingly visceral or very amazingly descriptive scenes of trying to figure out what kind of copper can be used, and it's just, I mean, if you really dig in there, there's so many rich scenes. But all of that work, that takes place across the periphery of Lahore, is essential to making the more central areas of Lahore, these middle class and upper class and upper caste regions, have this kind of aesthetic of cleanliness, that is supposed to be associated with that position in society. And so I think this kind of brings me to my first comment and question. So the book's historical chapter, chapter 2, really traces how this association between certain castes and waste work came to be in Lahore during the colonial era, as workers coming from agricultural, from a caste-based system that was based on agricultural work, in which, again, I don't know much about caste, but I'm repeating what the book is saying. People who were understood to be landless, who were meant to be just workers in the rural countryside, are brought into the city and actually recruited in by the British colonial regime into doing sweeping and other kinds of waste work in order to achieve this sort of ideal of sanitation, of hygiene that was in vogue in the late 19th century. But in so doing, they actually end up reifying their caste position within this new urban setting through their work with waste, and creating a new association of what their caste is basically associated with, what professions they're associated with. And this is then inherited and then passed down into the present. And so this is something that actually, people inherit these municipal jobs. And I think I'll get into this in a moment, but the government also is, as he gets into the next chapter, trying to actually bring these many different kinds of waste work into the fold and appearing to actually be in control of this very diffuse process. So what I think is interesting about this, and I think that's for my first comment, is that I was surprised in reading this not to see the issue or the concept of racial capitalism come up. And I'm completely aware that this is not a book about race, but and I'm not an expert at racial capitalism either, but it is something I'm teaching about in a couple of weeks, so it's been on my mind. So while I was reading that, and so my first question is really whether or not that there is something about the parallel to that literature on racial capitalism that might be valuable or might help us explain something. And I would say this because it does strike me that this intervention to suggest that these historical identities that predate capitalism are nevertheless essential for the functioning of capitalism very much parallels the argument of Cedric Robinson, who, for those of you who imagine most of you know, but just in case you don't, he was really looking at how these long-standing racial categories and forms of racial thinking in Europe were mobilized and became the basis of capitalism, and then were then exported and used, globally in a way that we now find more familiar. So my first question really is just how much that parallel to racial capitalism might be maybe implicitly in your thinking, or if you think it's useful, or if there's a real break, where the breaks and differences are between caste and race, I guess caste capitalism and racial capitalism, I don't know what the word would be, and especially how those would explain waste work in urban Pakistan. So my next comment then takes this question of capitalism, but goes in a bit of a different direction. One of the really interesting arguments that I was alluding to earlier from chapter 2 is that the state, which is this very diffuse, effect or thing, must and largely in some sense does succeed in bringing together all this kind of waste work, much of which is actually not conducted by people on the municipal payroll, but are actually informal workers who have arrangements with the municipal workers and with these local coordinators. And somehow all of this is coordinated and it appears to work, and the state takes basically responsibility and ownership over this process, and in order to produce the appearance that waste collection and disposal is actually something that's under its management. And so I want to stay with this moment, here with this question of appearances, but maybe take it to a broader register than beyond the chapter. Later in the book, he emphasizes the ways in which waste labor, the ways in which this waste labor, the waste work, enables the distancing of middle-class people or upper-caste people's refuse from themselves, right? It'll enable to produce that aesthetic of cleanliness. So much labor is required that he details so elegantly, and much of it, which, as Yefa mentioned, is extremely dangerous and exhausting. And ironically, there's a way in which that distancing is also not just about the waste, the material waste itself, but also the places where these waste workers themselves live, right? So as Lahore is urbanizing and expanding, and these middle class and upper caste settlements are expanding, they keep dispossessing and resettling the waste workers themselves, saying, no, you can't be doing that stuff, junkyard stuff here. You got to go to the periphery, right? Like they pick them up, and I mean, he describes families that have moved 5 times in a few decades. And so as these settlements, these middle class settlements expand, they're dispossessed. These waste workers are dispossessed and resettled over and over again. And all of what this does is to again distance the middle class and upper caste people, not only from their waste materials, but even the processes and sites where waste is collected, sorted, and disposed, making it further and further from their imagination and view. And I think the net effect of all of this then is to distance waste from the imagination of those whose voices count most in the political and economic system. And in the process, I think what this does, if we were to extend Wakas's argument a bit, is to produce the appearance that ever increasing amounts of waste can, in fact, go away. Which, I mean, of course, discard studies is very much focused on how waste doesn't go away at all. But in some sense, we have to contend with the fact that it does feel like it goes away for many people, right? And that's exactly the work that Wakas is showing is happening. And so the result, I mean, and I think Wakas would probably agree with this, is the perpetuation of this capitalist model of endless growth that depends on ever increasing amounts of waste on the planet. Now, I think the book probably hesitates to take this argument that far, in part because of the commitment to staying close to these processes of reproduction, which are necessary for capitalism, but, as he really importantly argues, are not reducible to it. But I think these stakes are very real and important to highlight, and I think the processes of reproduction he's describing here are actually crucial to maintaining this ever-increasing production of waste, which is where, I mean, if we put it all in perspective, where most of the surpluses are happening is in that level of production, right? It's not in this is, I mean, at this point, they're fighting over scraps of this, but the people making the most money are in the production process. And they need to produce the possibility of disposability, which means they need all these reproductive processes. And so I think then to come back to, as he describes, this question of the state needs to also project, in order to keep this whole system going and to keep capitalism going, they have to project and show that they have a plan, that they know what to do, that they're in control of this absurd flow of waste. And so that's what I think what importantly Wakas's book is showing, is how this really, I mean, seemingly untenable system is somehow made tenable, but often through this dangerous, exhausting work. So that's just, I think, one of the things that I take away from the book. But I now want to end my comments with sort of a provocation and a question, which maybe reflects my own ignorance about caste, but hopefully will be useful to think about. So while I'm quite convinced about the book's arguments about how waste builds on, how waste work builds on caste inequalities and reifies them, I also could not help, despite the fact I like discard studies, I could not help thinking what is so specific about waste here, right? I think, if anything, the book is actually making a broader argument than it actually suggests that it's doing. And what I mean by that is that, without knowing very much about Pakistan, is that I wonder if you could have written a quite similar book about other professions in the city and their relationship to waste and reproduction, right? One thinks of there's so many, these middle class and upper caste lifestyles require not just waste work, they require servants, they require cleaners, they require people to produce those things, right? They're also, just as, one thing that's very important that Wakas is showing is that these groups, in his case, the waste workers and these upper caste people, they're mutually dependent on one another. Their livelihoods, their reproduction, both of their reproductions are dependent on one another. But so are, again, the cleaners, the cooks, the drivers, the factory workers, et cetera. They also live in settlements which are, they're sustained by the wages they're able to, all of that is, there's a connection there. And they're also involved in the reproduction of these caste and class hierarchies. And I can't imagine that those people, working with, in people, especially in household work, are not coming themselves also from lower or even non-caste backgrounds. I'm not sure, but this is an open question for me. So if that answer is yes, if they are coming from sort of lower caste backgrounds, I can't, I think there's a connection here also in the sense of also literally working with waste, because maybe one of the distinctions here is that waste work, compared to other kinds of work, is so directly associated with something like contamination, with with dirt, with all with that, again, things I don't know about, but untouchability, etc. But the servants are also dealing with the waste, right? They're the ones who are cleaning the underwear with human waste on it. They're the ones washing the dishes with and then taking out the trash and handing it to the guy that Wakas is working with. So I mean, they're also touching the waste. The waste is also, they're part of that waste process, and so. Anyway, my point is just to ask them this question of provocation to say that to what extent is what Wakas is writing about actually a more general story about the continuing relevance of caste in Pakistan. Could you have written this about a different profession and come up to maybe similar conclusions? But if not, or in what ways might they have been different? So anyway, it was a wonderful book, really exciting to read, and gave me a lot to think about. So those are my questions and provocations. So thank you.
Dean and Yafa, thank you both so much. Wakas, we have the time for you to maybe respond to some of those questions and provocations. Those were both really great responses, and also covered, I think, a lot of ground, because you were kind of talking about different aspects of the book. So I'd love to hear, Wakas, your response.
Yeah. No, those are really, yeah, thanks so much, Yafa and Dean, for these comments. Also, I mean, thank you for Nitha and Aparna for organizing this conversation as well. Yeah, it's always it's a great experience, and also just hearing how other people read your work is always kind of you sometimes wish you had these comments before you wrote the book to sort of reformulate certain things, or just find different language to talk about certain things, which I find quite helpful. I'll try to kind of maybe address some things that are maybe shared between Yafa's comments and Dean's. And I think the kind of, one is sort of the intersectionality of caste, and the sort of racial capitalism question. I mean, I think, there's increasingly, I think there's more work that's being done to think about sort of, a very clear relationship between caste and capitalism coming out from work on India and urbanization there. I mean, the racial capitalism thing, I think, obviously, I've read the book, and I mean, I thought a lot about this. I guess is kind of what's going on in my head, of kind of what are the limits of thinking around caste and race together. Not that one can't do that, or that there's irreconcilable difference between these, or these are completely separate histories. Obviously, the histories of these are very interconnected, and part of that is the kind of current moment around how caste has entered public conversation on a global kind of stage, and as a way of sort of thinking about race as well. So I think the argument I'm making is very similar, that there's these social categories that pre-existed sort of expansion of sort of contemporary or modern capitalism, and so they're prior to and necessary for, but also are transformed by that kind of process. But I just sort of always had a kind of uncertainty about how to sort of integrate those two kind of concerns. And I do think there's something politically and intellectually important to hold on to the category of caste when talking about these issues, rather than sort of fold it into a kind of another story around the globalization of race or something like that. I think you can tell that story, but I sort of made a kind of decision to sort of really maintain tied to that kind of category of caste. I mean, one thing that I did find helpful, and it's cited in the chapter one after the introduction, of thinking about the idea of the racial contract, right? And that the contract, using that was quite helpful for me to think about how caste gets solidified as a kind of infrastructure, is this sort of this idea of a custom that then gets taken into the kind of modern contract, right? And I mean, that's directly from the kind of idea of the racial contract that I'm using, and some work on caste, the work of the pariah problem, I'm forgetting the author's name, where she talks about this idea of custom as it emerges in South India under colonial rule, and how that allowed all these kinds of unfree kind of practices associated with caste to be kind of integrated through the language of custom. So I mean, that literature is very influential, but I didn't necessarily use it in my own as a kind of analytic, I'd say, in that way. I mean, and this sort of folds into the intersectionality of caste. And I think even though caste is kind of the central claim, one of the central sort of stories I'm trying to tell, I think I am, and I think Yafa, you were right to sort of gesture to this, is I'm prioritizing caste, but as a way of sort of opening up the category of class, I think, where kind of class especially I think in kind of work on Pakistan, because of the sort of influence of certain types of writing, class was a really important way of understanding the state, sort of the actors that make up the state, urbanization, space, and and once you kind of, at some point maybe I'll do this, but once you actually go through some of that literature, a lot of how they talk about class are these sort of caste-based kind of relations, right? And so part of it was an intersectional approach around caste, class, and religion, but really around caste and class. I mean, the gender, and sort of to talk about the gender kind of question that you brought up, I think, I mean, the intimacy question around how sort of female workers navigate sort of the intimate spaces, I think that is one of the spaces where, I mean, there are two things that were included to me. One was that, because the presence of me in public with women in that way was quite a concern. So there's intimacy there, and then also the intimacy within the household, right? And I couldn't get to that really at all. But I think I sort of allude to it in a way where when I talk about, these narratives of these female workers is one of, the narrative was very kind of often like a male in the household, cannot work, gets injured, has a problem with, alcohol, drugs, this kind of stuff, and they're brought into the work. Or there's these relationships of, my mother did this work. I mean, there is a kind of really gendered aspect of this labor. And also, like, I mean, what's really interesting is the marriage practices, which I kind of talk about in the book too, and that's maybe my whatever anthropologist type of side of, like, a lot of these kind of questions around land, how land gets inherited or moved around, was through marriages. People married and they got access to land, or these kinds of things. And I talk about that in the book. So in a certain sense, I mean, I do think kind of to think about intersectionality around caste, I am using gender quite often in the book to kind of think around these things. Even if I think, it's always someone not criticized me, but like, there's like this trope of the male anthropologist being like, well, I couldn't do stuff on gender because I didn't have access to women. And I kind of do that. And I think I do a little bit of a disservice to some of the work that I was doing, which was actually kind of pursuing questions of gender. So anyway, that's like a kind of longer story, but I do think kind of the stuff that you're talking about is very much there. The tension that you sort of talk about, sort of this tension between kind of, the sort of extractiveness of this sort of whole system, and the structural kind of violence attached to it, right? That would be sort of, what I call kind of an extractive, damage-based kind of narrative, and then this sort of other narrative that sort of prioritizes reproduction. I mean, I think you're right to sort of identify this tension, and I think, like, I've fundamentally sort of, I think this tension itself is a productive one, right? I don't think I in any way resolve this tension, nor I do think this tension needs to be resolved, right? I mean, I think that's the kind of fundamental kind of feature of this type of work, but also just like this type of lives that emerge, that sort of have emerged, right? I mean, to think about, I mean, the sort of waste futures question, I've sort of thought about that a little bit for workers themselves. I think there is a kind of, You know, I mean, the last chapter kind of thinks about these questions of like futurity and sort of the past and sort of future and these kinds of questions vis-a-vis, you know, children and building a future for oneself. But I think that's really a future outside of waste. I don't think like it's not you know, waste is sort of ancillary to that story, right? And I think there's something where in the work I want to sort of, I mean, that's why the title of the book is called Life Beyond Waste. I mean, there is a kind of waste is a clear part of the story, but I also am very attuned to, especially for waste workers, where the association between this work and themselves and waste is so close. They always kind of want, I think they do create narratives outside of waste, right? So their future is not one in which waste is actually part of their future, right? So that's one kind of response to that. You know, this larger question of how, you know, other kinds of, I think it was sort of your use of language of sort of infrastructural work or other work that sort of sustains or maintains, repairs, sort of the life of the city in some sort of infrastructural sense. You know, I need to sort of think through that a little bit. You know, it's something that I have thought about, but I don't know how sort of the claims around reproduction maybe necessarily sort of attached to them. I don't know if the same kind of questions of social reproduction would be found in other kind of infrastructural work, especially outside of, let's say, South Asia. Within South Asia, I mean, there's some interesting, I mean, one place where it's sort of like, would be interesting is looking at gardening, right? I mean, gardening is quite often a very casted kind of labor, right? And it has sort of an institutional kind of, like, for example, I mean, the sort of parks and horticulture agency, quite often the sort of Malis, the gardeners are from a particular caste, right? So I think that is something where you could see a kind of sort of an intersection, right, around some of the stuff I'm talking about, around reproduction and social reproduction. Yeah, and I'm trying to think if there's, I mean, there's obviously a lot more in the comments. You know, yeah. Let me just check it. Let me pause there. I mean, Dina, I really liked your question on the sort of state that you brought up around sort of its, you know, it does succeed, and that how does it succeed? But what does that really tell us about kind of, you know, this idea of waste going away and sort of the kind of the appearance of that. So I did really appreciate that question. I mean, hopefully maybe in the Q&A, if we have more time, I can address it. Yeah, and also the disposability, circulation, and value kind of question that you brought up, Yafa, as well. You know, I think there's also more valuations too. Like those are two I chose because they were very salient. But I think there is a kind other valuations, for example, sort of containment, right? Containment is a very kind of clear valuation of waste materials and work, which I sort of have thought about too. And how that, I mean, and one aspect of this is how these sort of valuations of waste, maybe I'll end it with this, they're folded into kind of a logic of capital, I guess, but something like containment is sort of a logic of almost of securitization. And I think there is a kind of, when thinking about urban landscapes, that is, and ethnographically, this was kind of important in a couple of ways. One is sort of quite often the sort of criminalization of these sort of jugi settlements, right? This idea, sort of the criminalized spaces and sort of how a lot of the sort of young men from these communities circulate in the city and sort of criminalization, but also the kind of, and I talk about this, a large sort of Afghan refugee population that's very involved in waste work, and the kind of concerns around surveillance and security that they had. And, you know, I mentioned the book that I couldn't really do field work with them for these reasons. But I mean, that's where the kind of, there's another logic around waste materials and work that it obviously is folded into some sort of idea of the capitalist city and kind of constant accumulation and disposal, but also is a logic of like the state and questions of sovereignty and these kinds of things. So I mean, that's not an answer to your question, but just to say that I think you're right in to allude to that, but also that it's not limited to sort of one of the sort of traditional, or one of the logics of capital that I kind of identify. But so yeah, I'll just stop there and thank both of you for those comments. I'm sorry I didn't really do the great job of responding to them adequately. But yeah, thank you so much.
Podcast. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dean and Jafra, again, for just amazing set of discussion points. We'll open it up. And of course, I'm dying to have, I have a bunch of questions and thoughts, and but I'm going to hold them because I have access to workouts. We can chat later, but yeah, just any questions, discussions, and as I think Aparna just pointed out, please feel free to use the chat if you want, or just raise your hand and jump in. Thank you.
I mean, I can start with asking a question, and in true participant style, be more of a comment than a question. But I think I just took one of the things you were talking about with questions of gender and access, and one of the things that to me really stood out in the book, where you don't consistently kind of use the language to talk about it, but questions of masculinity, which I think is a really important part of the gender dimensions that you do have access to and that you are talking about in very meaningful ways. So yeah, that's, I don't know. I was thinking a lot about questions of masculinity as I was reading it, and I actually thought you got to a lot of questions of gender, perhaps beyond what you made claims to. So yeah, just I think that yeah, I don't know if you want to kind of chat about that or respond to that, but anyway, that was something that stood out to me.
Yeah, maybe I can, just respond. I mean, yeah, I think there was a lot ethnographically, there was a lot around like during my field work, it was very clear. I mean, not just that I was sort of obviously working a lot with male waste workers, but kind of questions of masculinity were very much there in a variety of ways. And I think that like you said, I sort of gesture to especially in the chapter, in chapter 5, obviously, where, the idea of building a home, and obviously that's very much tied to these kinds of issues. But, the sort of, the way in which this work is done quite often in public spaces, and the sort of, the sort of relationship between workers and supervisors, and how much kind of questions of masculinity are folded into that. So the idea of like shaming workers and these kinds of things, I think it was very much part of their sort of how they viewed themselves publicly, if that makes sense. That the kind of work that they're doing is something that's seen as undignified, but also there's a kind of feminization of the work as well as sort of workers. And there is, so there, and then I mean, and on top of that, there is a sort of own sense of masculinity. And there's more, there is more in the field work and whatever, my field notes and these kinds of things around, I think around a lot of these questions of thinking about their own sort of sense of being a man, and a lot of issues around sexuality and love and relationship, all these sorts of things. So yeah, I do think you're right to sort of indicate, and I think it's very similar to maybe kind of how I approached this question of women, that they're not absent from the story. They are sort of part of the narrative, whereas masculinity, I think, is part of the narrative, but not brought to the surface, I guess.
Thank you. Neither did you want to jump in?
I mean, if you let me, I'm just gonna jump in and then there won't be any talking. But I think it's because there's just so much richness in your book. I appreciated so much, Vikas, the way that you use the Urdu and Punjabi terms consistently, both in terms of like what people are saying in the terminologies they use. They resonate deeply for me because my own fieldwork with health workers, even though the bureaucracy around it is very different, of course, it's a very different, it's less complex of a context. It's less historically situated as well, different histories. But some of the terminologies from like things like pyar, mohabbat, the love and care, like, and the way that they are operationalized resonated just so much, and a lot of it. So that, thank you for that. But also, I was thinking about that specific set of those specific sets of terms and how they're used in in the way in which the bureaucracy and workers and these different kind of relationships disperse and to use Dean's terms, kind of diffuse. So the state is diffused in these different ways through these formal, informal, and other types of relations that you are unfolding, unpacking here, and how these kinds of terminologies seek to stabilize or destabilize relations through these kind of, like usages of terms like pyar and mohabbat, which are such intimate terms of, love and care. It's not, it's more than love, right? It's like something, so that really resonated for me. It makes me think about Dean's kind of question about the state's representation of itself as trying to stabilize itself, as doing the waste work of the city, but also how the fact that because of the intimate spaces in which it actually happens, that you're showing through these people entering homes and being part of that, and then the street and these divisions, the state also doesn't succeed in stabilizing, right? And that's kind of I think the ways in which these people on the ground, mobilize their own kind of small bits of power that they have, and not even power, but like persuasion tactics, for example, or these other they do, was really interesting. Sorry, it's not a question. I'm just kind of thinking through this kind of question of the state, but also at this kind of level of language, the street, the people, and the, entry and exit through spaces and circulations, how the state is constantly kind of fractured and rebuilt. And maybe if you can speak to, there's a question here, if you can speak to because I was taken with the very first kind of argument, kind of initial argument in your book about how these practices in Pakistan especially conceal caste. They naturalize it and conceal it. And this was really, like reading a lot of this was also novel for me as a Pakistani, as a Punjabi, as a Lahori, because caste was absent from my life in so many ways and still present in my life so many ways. And so that concealing, if you can talk about the concealing and how that concealing is maybe happening through some of these practices.
Yeah, no, that's a really I think important kind of question. I mean, one is, I do the kind of question of how these sorts of practices, linguistic practices, as well as sort of the kind of interpersonal relationships between both like these sort of low street level, I don't know if you want to call them bureaucrats, but sort of these people who kind of are part of the administration, right? But also the relationship between workers and these households and shops and all these sort of very kind of that on this, on the surface don't seem like relations of work, right? I mean, they are, relations of interpersonal relations, some sort of monetized exchange, but there's not a kind of you are my worker, right? It's a kind of contractual labor. But I think the kind of language, the language sort of examples that you gave, I think that's sort of, within the kind of bureaucratic structure. I mean, that the ability to mobilize language and those interpersonal relations was, essential part of the state doing its work. Like, it's not that I'm like, oh, this is happening and the state is somehow present but not really doing anything. I mean, it is kind of how the state actually mobilizes, and it seems like, I mean, that's where that first chapter is also kind of important, is because I mean, the same issues that the state's dealing with vis-a-vis its workers is the same issue that the colonial state was dealing vis-a-vis its workers as well, and sort of the contractors and all these kinds of things. Obviously, I don't have access to like these linguistic exchanges, 100 years ago, but it's clear that that figure of the low-level bureaucrat who is kind of part with the workers, but also separate from them, has the kind of linguistic and interpersonal kind of skills to deal with workers, is always kind of a figure of suspicion for kind of these upper-level bureaucrats, right? So I think those persuasion tactics are, yeah, I mean, it's also interesting or important because it was, part of, like Dean mentioned, was my field work was accompanying waste workers, but I spent a lot of time with these sort of low-level supervisors. And like at a certain point, I realized, oh, their work is speaking. Like that's 95% of their work is like getting workers to work by like convincing them in various ways. And I think that convincing is, I mean, it's very hierarchical. It's very part of this sort of structural violence. Like, I mean, the way in which they demean workers is obviously like very much part of it. But it's the fact that you have to persuade someone assumes that you may not persuade. There's a possibility of failure, right? And I think I was very attuned to that. I was like, yeah, it was something that I kind of not attuned to it, but I realized at certain points, like they had to constantly persuade these people because like there was this possibility that, you can just not do this work and there's no one else that's going to do this work if people don't do it. I mean, this other kind of question of concealing and naturalizing caste around the issue of language and the state. One is this sort of, I think, the kind of question of the state is this ability to kind of distance itself from this being a caste-based kind of work, right? And that's really by emphasizing for the state that this is contractual free labor, right? People can enter into this work and leave this work based off of, and you get a wage for this. I mean, there's all these assumptions that this is a free contract that people are entering into, but but it's only successful, like you and Dean mentioned, is this whole other space of activity that's sort of formally put outside the state's parameters, that the state will say that, oh, that's whatever custom, or that's tradition, or that's caste. What we're doing is not caste. But there's sort of division between what is caste and what's contract is very blurred. And I mean, in the book I say sort of caste is the content of contract, right? If there's a contract that's sort of this legal document, the actual content of it, or what gives it meaning, is this sort of caste-based relation. And then the other kind of question of language, I mean, I think a lot of this language around Pyar se, mohabbat se, like all this other language, higher kind of language, the way of talking about another person as a child or as someone as a inferior, various forms of address. I mean, joking. I mean, I think that kind of in that chapter on chapter 2, where the supervisors would quite often, and this kind of gets to maybe something that when Aparna and Yafa were talking about, the way in which workers get teased about sexual joking and teasing and this kind of stuff. I'm trying to think. I think the aspect of that is the kind of cross-caste, cross-class kind of lines that are being maybe reworked. But so I think that kind of language around the state and language around the language that's used and sort of some of the language around the state that use is kind of central to how caste gets concealed and naturalized. But also the kind of difficulties, and I've talked about this in other contexts of, the difficulty of getting people, even sort of waste workers, to sort of talk about caste themselves, and the terms that I had to kind of use, because I would use the kind of traditional, whatever Urdu term for caste as zat, and it didn't quite resonate. And I would talk about like baradari as like whatever, and that wouldn't work. And it was when I used the term of qom, like what your qom and this kind of stuff, and that's where caste started to resonate. And qom could mean people, it could mean nation, this kind of stuff. And so it was really through the language of qom that people were thinking, could talk to me about caste, and and really subcaste, right? That was sort of what was essentially what I was kind of looking at. So, and I think that language, the sort of question of the language around caste actually is part of the kind of not part of the it's part of the problem, but it's also part of how it gets naturalized and concealed, and kind of how to kind of get to it in a kind of analytical and political kind of way. So yeah, I mean, I think that's, yeah, I mean, the kind of attentiveness to language, I think, was I don't know, a huge part of kind of the field work, but also kind of writing the story that I kind of wanted to end up writing.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Mm.
We have a little bit more time, so if there's any other questions or thoughts.
Well, I'm just gonna, please feel free to, if anyone else wants to jump in, I'm just curious about, and actually, because you kind of answered a little bit of one of the questions that I had, which was, how did you talk about caste if that's not something that's as legible of a category, even if it is completely present? And this kind of idea of moving to slightly of kind of getting at it through adjacencies, particularly that of COM, that's really interesting, because like I would, at least in the way that I've heard it used, is usually more about nation, culture, and not so much about caste. So it's also, but I mean, yeah, it's interesting how you kind of have to get at it in through adjacencies, right? And yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to that methodologically, but also like in kind of how you're reading, documents, to kind of like when you're kind of looking at like the different methods through which you're doing your work, how do you kind of unravel caste when that's not necessarily how people are talking about things, even if it is an implicit framework that is present?
Yeah, that's a good question. Trying to think, the sort of adjacency. I mean, yeah, trying to think through. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the archival materials that I was looking at, or sort of the yeah, a lot of the archival materials I was looking at were, largely government documents, and so I mean, from sort of like public health reports, sanitation kind of stuff, municipal proceedings as well. And in those, I mean, sometimes they would explicitly name sort of caste groups that are doing this work or something along those lines. But quite often, the language was not, was not present. I mean, it would be talking about, let's say, workers or something like that. There was some discussion of, sweeper colonies and this kind of stuff in some documentation. And so I do think there's a kind of, for part of it was sort of trying to kind of, yeah, the archival stuff or the historical materials, trying to read kind of, implicitly some sort of assumptions that are going on in the documents themselves. I think there were a few public health reports where there were sort of long conversations around the status of workers and these kinds of things, and I couldn't help, even though obviously they never named the caste or anything like that, it was very clear that there was a kind of concern around the availability of these workers. I mean, it's just very clear that that was what was going on. And I do think there is a kind of adjacency, but also kind of like trying to connect different kinds of materials that I was working with. So looking, both at sort of these government documents, but looking at some sort of missionary reports around this time as well, and sort of trying to coordinate those materials. But then also, I mean, I do think this is kind of part of how I like the methodology that I sort of adopted around thinking around caste was, obviously focusing on waste workers was very clear that, okay, they're from sort of caste backgrounds, they deal with caste stigma. It was very kind of clear, but like, I didn't think, the sort of intimacy kind of question would be something, but that's like a clear site in which this caste stuff is very much plays out, right? Or the kind of language, right? Being attentive to how language is being used, and the kind of language that's being used, right? So like, I think I don't know. I think maybe Aparna, you brought up, or Yafa, this idea of who gives, and these practices of who gives and who receives, right? I mean, that's very well established in sort of this older literature on caste, and I think looking at those practices that aren't named as caste, right? But you can kind of tell that there's this sort of hierarchy built into those practices and these linguistic exchanges. I do think that's another kind of methodological approach that I needed to sort of to think not directly, okay, caste is about X people, or who can eat this or who can't eat this, or questions of touch, and I mean those are going on, but they're not always, they're just not always present, right? And that to reduce caste to that is to kind of delimit its field of operations on some level.
Thank you. I think the connection to gift giving is an interesting one way to kind of the benevolence model, thinking about caste, and kind of how that's used to cement hierarchies is an interesting one.
If no one else had a question, I did have one other sort of more just methodological question. I was really curious, and I think maybe this, since it sounds like there's some students on the call too, it might be fun to hear more about the background of your work. Because in parts of the book, you allude to your position as a Pakistani American. You also talk about initially, I think, wanting to study religion and then switching. But like, can you tell us more about that pathway into it? And I think that also relates to this also question of access and how they saw you and all these things. I mean, I think that the backstory to the book would be so interesting to hear.
Yeah, no, it's a good thing to talk about, always sort of like how you ended up doing what you kind of did. And I think, I mean, when I've given like other kind of talks about the book, it's, I really start off with the coda where I go to that village where, there's a moment in which, the person says that like, if you don't take the Shahadat, the Islamic testament of faith, like people who don't do that have a smell, and it sort of brought up all these questions around caste, stigma, and Christians. And, I talk about how I was interested in Christians as a religious minority. And I think when I start talks, I usually start with that because I think it kind of, the journey of doing this project was very long, obviously. I mean, the PhD is always long, but it's like, there's also this kind of moment, yeah, I don't know, maybe it's not relevant for this talk today, but like, I started my field work in a context where like blasphemy allegations were really high in Pakistan. And, it was, I mean, they're still there, but it was kind of, that was the context in which I was working. And I really framed the project at that time around questions of religion and secularity and these kinds of questions. And, when I started doing field work, there was a series of sort of bombings, basically, of attacks on Christian churches, which really made field work hard for me, but also for obviously other people as well. And I think at that moment, I sort of was realizing what kind of like the ethics of research and questions of access and these kinds of things, and how those questions of ethics of research and access fundamentally do change the kinds of questions you ask, right? And I think, slowly I sort of shifted away from, that project that was sort of really focused in on kind of questions of religion and minority religion and secularity, and shifted towards these questions around waste, work, and caste, and these things to tell a kind of another story that's not unrelated to the story around blasphemy, right, which I talk about in the book at various moments. And so as I shifted, the research project shifted quite a bit. And so, I think it was, 4 months, 3-4 months into like my long-term field work. And so, it's always really scary when you start, a plan of 2-year research project, and 3 months later, you're like, all right, I'm not going to do that whole project and shift to something different. So that was quite scary. But, I shifted to working with waste workers, and and sort of now coming to the second part of what you're asking, I think, Dean, of like, it was interesting because I came to all the different types of actors through different networks of that I was, I guess, part of. And one was sort of municipal sanitation workers, I got access to through kind of very much through the top, right? So I had a friend who teaches at a university in Lahore who, put me in touch with one of the waste managers of the sort of municipal department. And then he was like, okay, you can do field work, and here's a supervisor, you accompany them. And then that eventually led to workers. And then, so the municipal sanitation workers, that's the sort of line of access. Informal waste workers was interesting because they were, I think I mentioned in the book, they were being prevented from collecting waste from municipal containers, and they did all these series of sort of actions to sort of stop the sort of privatized company. And they were in touch with a kind of, this sort of group of sort of labor organizers, leftist parties in Lahore, and I was sort of knew those people. And so I came in very much through their kind of attempts to basically mobilize and organize around getting their access to waste disturbed, right? So, and that was really how I came into the informal sector. And with the Kabadia and the middlemen, the junkyard owners and middlemen, it was, part of it was building, that was part of it was building relationships through informal workers and eventually building it with sort of these waste traders, basically. But also to your point, Dean, like the real site of accumulation is like this production that happening at the very large scale and other sites. And I didn't necessarily visit like paper making factories or something like that, but a distant relative of mine, is a book publisher in Urdu Bazaar, and I did interviews with him and his people to kind of get a sense of these kind of things. And so it was kind of methodologically, I really needed to, I guess this is all research, but like really kind of situate myself in different places, but also knowing that how I came to situate myself was going to affect the kinds of questions that I'm asking, right? So the fact that I came to municipal sanitation workers through this very kind of formalized way, as opposed to coming through some sort of political party or activist organization on the other way, really kind of shaped how I approached them and how they approached me. The last thing about sort of being sort of Pakistani American or being diasporic, I think it offered some degree of legibility to me, but I would be interested. I think there was a degree of still being very much an outsider, right? I wasn't the kind of actual Pakistani coming from the middle class area that would have been a degree of intimacy there that I think would have been hard. Whereas, as someone who's coming really from the outside and is read that way, is legible that way, there was a degree of that. In one of the quotes in one of the chapters, it's a blasphemy allegation that he's talking about, and he attaches me to a Christian kind of context, right? And I think that it's very clear that I'm coming from this outside, and they can engage with me as like a foreigner in some way. And so I do kind of, part of that isn't that like I couldn't understand what they're saying, but like your positionality kind of shapes how, the kind of responses that you get and the kind of questions that you're going to ask and what your answers kind of look like to those questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Amazing. And Dean, thank you for actually asking that question. My students are on the call, and I am very excited to kind of go back and talk about this next Wednesday. So with all of them. And actually, one of them just texted me and said that their question got answered in the process of this conversation. But I do want to, we did have like a 1-hour conversation beforehand about the book. Really fun. And so, well, thank you so much, Vikas, Dean, and Yafa, just for being with us and sharing. And thank you, Vikas, so much for this book. There's so much more to discuss and think together about. Yeah. We have just like any closing comments, anything else, Aparna?
This is our website. This is the call for case studies. We are, it's the call. Those are the two things I wanted to share, but I just also wanted to reiterate what Nida said in thanking Vikas for this really rich and insightful book, and to Dean and Yafa for raising really helping draw out some important themes and cross-cutting questions that come up through it. So yeah, I also wanted to thank everyone who joined the panel today. Really appreciate that as well. If you aren't on our listserv, please reach out to me or Nida. We're happy to add you in. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so
Yeah.
much. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Bakash.
Of course, thanks for those comments were really great. I appreciate it. Sorry, yeah, they're really good. I was trying to answer as much as possible, but it's always hard to kind of like touch upon everything.
Oh no, it was great. It was so rich. I really found this incredibly rich. And also Dean's comments and everyone's questions have given me, I've taken 3 pages of notes myself. So it's been really rich. So I wanted to thank everyone for being part of this.
Yeah, thank you for having us. And I mean, offline, maybe one day we'll chat more about this book. There's a lot of similarities in the kind of field of work we were doing. So I was
absolutely.
also, as I'm trying to beginning to write my book, look at your book and be like, how do you do this? So, well, great. Well, thank you for the invitation, Aparna.
Yeah, of course.
Nice to meet you, Yafa.
And nice to meet you too, Dean.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.